joining me today. I'm going to be talking about our favorite subject, radiation. So, lots of things in this show that I want to talk to you about. There have been over 15 years of testing about Alzheimer's. 15 years. And yes, the research all fell apart. Yet they still have pills for sale. Interesting thing, right? And in the mining process, the actual uranium, that comes with sulfur. Sulfur, listen to this. This really got me going backwards in a spin. Do you realize that just to help us out, they're adding sulfur to our home heating gas? I'll be getting more into that later, obviously. Sulfur is in the uranium itself and pretty much everywhere. It amazes me how they were able to narrow these lawsuits down to just uranium. Because I've had a lot of issues going on personally with the exposure I've had from all of this and trying to figure it out. So I thought, well, let me take another look at these native Indian lawsuits again. It actually boggles my mind what I uncover this time. The entire chain of evidence that started this whole thing starts with radon. Radon, which is questionable to put it mildly, in the entire process inside the mines, not only dealing with uranium, but all of that sulfur. The chain of so called doctors is another point to that I'll be talking about today. Who treated these people? Who set them up? Alzheimer's right now is a leading disease and it's rapidly on the rise. There is medication available, but not what we might think. Chronic exposure to sulfur related gases, pay attention to this. Chronic exposure to sulfur related gases and uranium or heavy metals associated with uranium mining can produce neurological symptoms that resemble and actually mimic Alzheimer's disease. You think that's the problem they're having with coming up with Alzheimer's disease studies because sulfur and uranium mimic the neurological symptoms? Or maybe they are the neurological symptoms, right? Maybe we're not mimicking anything. Certain toxic exposures, especially carbon monoxide, heavy metals like lead and mercury, and some industrial gases can produce cognitive symptoms that resemble dementia and may be mistaken for Alzheimer's in early stages. Everything is not down and ugly. This is actually a fantastic idea if you're a psychopath and you want to murder the rest of the people on the planet. Because remember, what happens with Alzheimer's? Well, you lose your memory. People will be walking around saying, "Hey, I don't know who killed me." So let's start talking. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be changing my entire world here, but I'm not going to get into it right now. I have had so many of these symptoms, and so that's why I went looking through these files again to see if they were normal because it's so crazy feeling. So, anyway, so what I'm going to start with is a couple of the symptoms because remember, a lot of the native Indian people, if you didn't listen to those shows, you're going to be lost, but nothing I can do about it. But a lot of the native Indian people were written off as being crazy, right? Because the effect of all of this, whether it's sulfur, uranium, or whatever it is, you end up looking crazy, okay? I'll update my photos, but anyway, you end up looking like an insane person. I can guarantee you, if I walked into a U.S. hospital today, I would be admitted to the insane ward because they'd say, "Hey, nobody doesn't get this treated. It has to be a crazy person, right?" So one of the main things that's going on that added to this crazy thing is this. You get this sensation. So I was trying to think, how am I going to describe to people today how this really feels? Because what happened essentially was this. When the first explosion happened in my house, when they hooked up that smart meter to the transformer, I went through a near death experience. They almost killed me. I've recorded all of this, so I can't start recording everything all over again. So you need to pay attention and maybe do your own research into what I've said in the past because I'm not in the business to be able to say much a couple of times. Okay, just hear me out here. So anyhow, so I started thinking about things and I thought, well, how would I describe this? Well, so when I had that first incident, I got this sore on my face, okay? It was a very small little sore. And come to find out, people going through heavy amounts of radiation, uranium, or whatever you want to call it, typically end up with a sore on their face or their hands. Okay, that's very typical of people who have been exposed to this radiation or the sulfur. Okay, but that sore on my face has gotten tremendously worse in the last few months to the point that I soon may not be able to speak. So I have been following my instincts on this deal from day one. Like I knew early on, get some help. You better figure this stuff out. So anyhow, so I'm going to be reevaluating what I'm able to do later. But so anyway, so if you get exposed, you get this sore on your face or hands because, and I'll explain more why later. So anyway, so I got this sore. So what happens with this sore? Well, you get these weird sensations. First of all, if you were to ask me, what does that sore feel like? I would have to say it feels like somebody came along and they had a cigarette that was lit and they literally put it onto my face and just kept bearing down on my skin. That's what it feels like. And it feels like when they were in there burning it, they inserted shards of glass. So sometimes when you move a certain way, because the sore on my face is right near my lips. So when you move a certain way, you get this because this shard of glass like cuts into your skin. And the other sensation you get, you feel like bugs are crawling on your face. Yeah, it's really weird. You feel like you got bugs crawling. And actually, there is a name for this. It's called formication, a sensation of insects crawling on or under the skin. So you can imagine people from the native land. They're going in, they're trying to describe these things. They don't speak the same language as the clinicians and stuff, right? And they're trying to describe that they got these bugs crawling on their skin feeling, right? Well, that alone sent them directly into the crazy farm, right? So it's not automatically psychiatric, but it was well documented in all these cases, okay? In mining populations, including uranium and hard rock mining, several exposures can produce this exact sensation, the bugs crawling on your skin. Is coming from a chemical irritation, the hydrogen sulfide and the sulfide dioxide. And the effects are the skin irritation, the burning and itching. The itching is just, I'm talking about off of the charts because of the nerve irritation. And because of that nerve irritation, you get this crawling sensation. So the gases didn't just irritate the surface, they affect all the peripheral nerves around it. So, especially with repeated exposure. And because mine continues to get worse, I'm obviously getting repeated exposure. So, let's take a look at some of these elements. The heavy metals, they're often present alongside uranium ore. Uranium ore bodies frequently include arsenic, lead, and mercury in some regions. And from that, you get this peripheral neuropathy, tingling, itching, crawling sensations, and poor wound healing. If you get a wound that doesn't heal, you're likely looking at a chemical wound, not a regular wound. It's chemical. It does not behave the same way, and I'll be telling you more about how to look for that later. But so the miners reported this. They reported non-healing sores. They reported ulcerations and skin breakdown. So when nerves are damaged and damaged skin are irritated or regenerating, they misfire. And the brain interprets it as movements like bugs crawling. So when a patient says this, it feels like bugs are crawling on me. A clinician may think, well, I've got a delusional person on my hand. Instead of thinking, well, could be chemical exposure, neuropathy, or an occupational injury. Oh no, they didn't think of any of those things. They immediately thought, this person is crazy. And in many of these native mining communities, there were language barriers, limited access to specialists, minimal early occupational health training. So symptoms were often described in plain sensory terms, not translated into clinical language. They didn't know what these words knew. They knew they had things like bugs crawling, burning skin, wounds that wouldn't heal. But how did those get interpreted? Well, they interpreted them as psychiatric. The burning skin, they thought, well, they just got some sort of dermatitis and maybe they got poor hygiene. And when they came in complaining about the wounds that won't heal, which are indicators for toxic injury, they said, these people are kind of dirty. They got poor hygiene. So what they did was they set up a credibility trap. The more vivid and accurate the symptom description, the more likely it is to be dismissed as psychological. So, and that works directly against those workmen's compensation claims. So, what is actually documented? Well, a lot of this neuropathy in mining populations, a lot of skin lesions and non healing sores, a lot of chemical irritation from sulfur compounds, and heavy metal exposure effects. So, direct quotes like bugs crawling, these show up in the oral histories in different areas, but they were not really captured in the formal records. But the sensation itself is medically legitimate. It is consistent with known exposure in mining environments. So, the language used to describe it can also trigger psychiatric mislabeling and undermine the person's credibility and reduce legal recognition of harm. And that is key, right? This is all about who's going to get paid and who's not going to get paid, right? So, what did they leave out? Sulfur in mines is usually not a dry yellow powder floating around. It shows up in two main forms, and this is critical. I did not know that sulfur was on the scene so early on. In the show that I talked about them using sulfur in the mines, it looked like okay, you go into a mine, you pull out the sulfur. I mean, excuse me, you pull out the uranium, right? And to pull out the uranium, you're spraying sulfur around, right? But the uranium itself comes with sulfur. So, as part of solid minerals, when crushed and dried, they become sulfide dust particles. And these behave like other fine dust and can be inhaled. So, they also get in contact with gases, the hydrogen sulfide. It's not a powder, and it comes off during the blasting, chemical reactions, and the breakdown of the sulfide materials. So they get this stuff there, but it's not really dry powder, okay? It gets mixed with all the airborne stuff. And I'm not going to get too technical here, so don't really worry about that. But what we're looking at is when they're in that mine, they're also drying things. So, yeah, and I'll go through all these steps very simply in a bit here. So, every step along the way, there's lots and lots of sulfur being involved. So, as part of the drying process, drying doesn't create sulfur, but it turns mixed ore into breathable dust. So, yeah, it's pretty crazy how that sulfur just gets in there. So, let me come up with a little story for you. We're going to have to go back to basics here and understand this completely, okay? Think about this. We're in the kitchen and we're making some chocolate chip cookies, okay? Think of it like trying to get chocolate out of the messy mix. We got this all this mix of things and we got the chocolate chips in there too. So you start with a big pile of chocolate chips, and this is the uranium. Okay, well, pretend the chocolate chips are the uranium. And you've also got dirt and rocks, but you've also got some sticky, stinky crumbs in there, and that's the sulfur. So in order to make these chocolate chips, which is the uranium, you also have dirt and rocks, and you have these sticky crumbs, which are the sulfur. And these in the mine are all mixed together, okay? So when miners dig, they don't just dig the chocolate chips. They get the whole pile, the chocolate, the dirt, and the stinky crumbs, which is the sulfur. But then after they dig it up, they have to wash it. And they wash it to get the chocolate out, which is the uranium, right? They wash the pile with special liquids. These liquids help separate the chocolate from everything else. Some of these chemicals can even involve sulfur. The goal is simple: keep the chocolate, remove the mess. So then, after washing, They keep the chocolate, which is the uranium, and they try to throw away the dirt and the stinky crumbs, which are the sulfur. Because in the end, they just want clean uranium. The miners don't just handle the clean chocolate, they work inside the whole messy mix the entire time. That means they are around dust in the air, tiny sulfur particles, gases from the rock, and radiation from uranium. They are breathing and touching all of it at once. These things don't act the same. The uranium and also the radon gas, pay attention to this. So, the uranium and radon gas causes harm slowly over time, whereas the sulfur causes irritation right away, eyes, skin, and lungs. One hurts you later, one you feel immediately. The bottom line, the uranium or the chocolate starts mixed with sulfur in the ground. The process tries to remove the sulfur, but the miners are exposed to the entire mix while the work is happening. So miners aren't exposed to one thing, they were living inside the entire chemical environment of the mine itself. So, step one, the uranium is turned into a concentrate. After the ore is dug up and processed, the uranium is separated from the rock and chemicals. It ends up as a powdery material called yellow cake. It looks more like mustard colored sand or powder than rock. This is the first finished form that leaves the mine site. So that is gone. It's leaving the mine site now. So when it was there in the mine, it was there doing all of that stuff, right? Sulfur all over the place, right? So how does it leave the mine? How does it get packaged? Well, the yellow cake, which supposedly is just the uranium, they've taken everything out, right? That was dried into a stable powder. It was packed into sealed steel drums, typically 400 to 450 pounds each. It was labeled and tracked and very tightly regulated. So the yellow cake uranium gets packaged up, right? At this stage, it is not highly radioactive like nuclear fuel, but it is still toxic and controlled. So it's handled carefully, but it's not glowing rods or anything like that. So, what's step three? Where does it go next? Well, from the mill or the mine, the drums, those big 400-pound drums, are shipped to conversion facilities. They turn the yellow cake into uranium. They also have enrichment plants. They increase the usable uranium. That's the U-235. And there's also fuel fabrication plants. They turn it into fuel pellets and rods for reactors. But what happens to that leftover mix that they were having all back in the mine? Well, that part often gets overlooked. After uranium is removed, what's left is called tailings. Tailings include crushed rock, residual sulfur compounds, heavy metals, small amounts of leftover radioactive material. So, step five, how these tailings are handled. Tailings are then mixed with water into a slurry. They're stored in large contamination areas, tailing ponds or piles, they're called. And these sites are engineered to hold long term waste. They're covered or stabilized to reduce dust and spread. But they can remain hazardous for decades to centuries. So, why do tailings matter? Even after uranium is removed, radiation remains and continues to produce radon gas. Pay attention to radon. Sulfur compounds can be present. Dust can carry contaminants into nearby areas. So that messy mix didn't just disappear, it gets moved and stored. So uranium leaves the mine as a yellow powder in sealed drums. it goes on to be turned into nuclear fuel. Everything else, the dirt, sulfur, leftover radiation, they stay behind in large waste piles called tailings. So the uranium leaves in sealed drums. The rest of the chemical mess stays behind, still active, still sitting there. So it wasn't that sulfur was hidden or completely ignored. It's that the legal cases focused on what was the strongest, clearest, and most provable. And here's where you need to really pay attention. Radon from uranium, they said, was a clear link to lung cancer, measurable exposure, and had strong scientific consensus. Sulfur exposure, the real symptoms, those burning eyes, the skin irritation, the breathing issues, they were harder to tie to long-term compensable death outcomes. So they said this. They said, well, some of this stuff takes a really long time to come to play. So let's deal with that, not these short-term things they're calling sulfur. But the key is here. They're talking about radon, okay? Pay attention to that. I'll be getting back to radon in a bit here. Radon is basically a made-up fantasy. So this entire thing has been based on radon, and they say that radon is a clear link to lung cancer. They say that radon can be measured and has strong scientific consensus. So legally, radon became the centerpiece claim. Sulfur stayed more in the background as part of the overall exposure environment. They claim the cases focused on what could be proven in court. Radon and cancer, while the day-to-day chemical exposure miners actually felt never took center stage. What hurt them slowly won in court. What hurt them every day was not even included. So anyway, so they came up with all these symptoms: night sweats, sleeping issues, headaches, flushing, wound care, and what these wounds look like. A chemical wound does not look like a regular wound. It is not flat. It's raised, and it has these the scabs on a chemical wound. I've shown you pictures of them because I've got the one on my face. It is a strange wound that is like bubbly looking is the best way to describe it. When that scab is removed, another key thing, you do not get much bleeding. It is a chemical wound, which is completely different. And also early on, I learned a lot from that professor who teaches nuclear, and he has a YouTube channel, and he talked early on about the final stage being flushing. So I went looking for flushing. I have like a light undertone of flushing all over my face right now. But when it gets hot or something happens, my entire face flushes to the bright, bright red. Well, that flushing comes from increased blood flow, and the heat causes the flushing, and it brings inflammatory mediators to the surface, is what it is. So while they're in those mines, they also get sweat and salt. The sweat contains salt and trace irritants. So the constant wetting, the skin barrier breakdown, the skin becomes softer and more vulnerable to abrasion. And that is what leads to non healing sores or irritation points. So, sulfur in mines is typically presented as hydrogen sulfur, the gas, sulfur dioxide, the gas, or sulfur materials as particulates. So, what happens is this: when those miners really got a full blast, because it's the heat, the sweat, and the sulfur. And that's like I've been saying all along. I feel so much worse in my house during the summertime when it gets hot in here. It is absolutely horrific. And I'll be getting more into that because running heat makes you a lot sicker. So people will retreat to their homes thinking they're feeling sick, right? They'll close up their house, they'll turn on their heater and sit inside that heated home. And actually, mechanically, you're making yourself a lot sicker. So, because the dust and sulfur compounds settle on the skin, the heat and the sweating, the sweat and the sulfur begins the chemical irritation, and that weakens your skin barrier. And that's where you get the minor irritation that becomes lesions. So, with no cooling and repeated exposure, you have no healing window for any of that. So, these workers had no air conditioning, limited running water, and dust carried into the home. So instead of recovery, they had continuous low level exposure and heat stress. That's how you get persistent irritation, chronic sores, symptoms that don't resolve. So it's documented that there was heat stress in mines, there was poor ventilation, skin irritation from chemical exposure, lack of adequate housing conditions. Heat amplified the skin damage from sulfur compounds. Yes, heat makes it wickedly worse. And the lack of cooling prevented healing. So, yeah, heat would almost certainly make skin conditions worse, not in a vague way, but in a mechanical, biological way. Heat opens up the skin. Carries irritants deeper. No cooling means no healing. So instead of a minor irritation clearing up, it becomes persistent, inflamed, and slow to heal. So, who had control over all of this? Who was in charge? Well, some of this I've covered in the past, some of it I have not, but to put it into context, from 1946 to 1974, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission was the central driver of uranium mining during the Cold War. Their mission was to secure uranium for nuclear weapon production. So, their role was to set procurement contracts and pricing, encourage rapid development in the Southwest, controlled access to uranium markets. So, the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, prioritized production, not worker safety. It had knowledge of radiation risks, including radon, but did not require ventilation or warn miners for years. Who else was in charge? Well, the U.S. Public Health Service. They began studying miners in the 1950s. And keep in mind, they actually started studying sulfur in 1901. Sulfur has been well known for a very long time. It was chosen on purpose. It is a brutally psychopathic way to try to get somebody down. It is a horrific thing to do to somebody. And only a group of psychopaths would cook this up. The pain is actually off of the charts. So they knew all along. The U.S. Public Health Service, they began studying these miners in the 1950s. I was born in 1951. They conducted studies on uranium miners. They measured the radon levels in mines. They published internal reports linking exposure to cancer. So we got the cancer and the radon. That came from the U.S. Public Health Service. Radon is not even true, okay? So right off the bat, the entire basis of all of this is radon, okay? So here you go. They conducted the studies on uranium miners. They measured the radon levels in mines. That was not even true, right? And they republished these reports linking exposure to lung cancer. And this is key. And that is how they were able to take all of these things going on and say, nope, it's got to have lung cancer in it. It's got to be long term. So, all of these short term things you people are suffering from, too bad. We're just going to focus on the radon, which is where 100% the entire trick got started. Because these findings were largely kept in scientific channels, there was no enforcement power. Miners were not clearly informed in plain language. So then along came the U.S. Bureau of Mines. They conducted mining research. They advised on ventilation techniques, but they could recommend but could not enforce safety standards. And we also had the U.S. Department of Interior. You're starting to think there's a lot of groups involved. Well, there were. And that is the trick here, right? Get a lot of people involved, and then no one will see what the main issue is, right? The Department of Land and Leasing Authority, the U.S. Department of Interior, they oversaw mineral leasing on federal and some tribal lands. They managed relationships involving the land use. Their focus was on resource extraction, not health enforcement. Then we had the tribal lands, the jurisdictional gap. Most uranium mining occurred on native Navajo Nation and other tribal lands, creating a legal gray zone. Now, wasn't that handy, right? Federal government had trust responsibility over tribes. Private mining companies operated mines. Tribal governments had limited regulatory power at the time. So no entity clearly enforced worker safety standards or air quality protections or health disclosures. And of course, you're thinking, well, where's OSHA? Well, OSHA came along in the 1970s, a little bit too late for this early group. So there was no real oversight in practice, only pieces of it. No urgency on any of them for safety. The government knew about radon risk. Yeah, because the government actually cooked up the radon false records, but failed to warn or regulate in time. Well, that was part of the trick, right? Because why would you want to warn about radon when radon is going to be your biggest trick, right? So, anyway, so this led to, and if you're lost, you don't know the radon stuff. I covered this in the show about the native Indians, and I'll have more about that in a little bit here. So just hang on there, okay? But the radon is the trick part, okay? So there wasn't one single group. The absence of clear oversight is exactly what allowed the exposure to continue for decades. And I would have to say 100% on purpose. I've seen this time and time and time again. Among Navajo and other native miners working uranium in mixed ore mines in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, roughly from the 1940s to the 1980s, medical and legal records consistently described respiratory symptoms, chronic cough, shortness of breath, chest tightness, neurological headaches, dizziness, fatigue, dermatology, non-healing sores, skin irritation, eyes, burning eyes, watering and tearing, late-stage disease, lung cancer, strongly linked to radon decay products, and pulmonary fibrosis. These show up repeatedly in public health records and other court filings. So, yeah. And then I also went to look for this flushing thing. What the guy from that teaches your nuclear plant stuff, that professor, what he said was this. He said the final stage of exposure is the flushing and the complete hair loss. That's all he said, okay? So I looked into the flushing to see if it was in the records. And it says, let me see. The term flushing, which means sudden skin reddening, heat sensation in face upper or upper body, is not commonly listed as a primary recorded symptom. However, it doesn't mean it didn't occur. Why flushing could plausibly happen? Several exposure factors in those mines could produce flushing physiologically. Arizona plateau, extreme thermal stress. Yeah, that's the other thing. They were making them do all this work in the desert heat, right? And heat makes it so much worse. I really dread summer. Anyway, so um, let me see. Heat and dehydration. That's your baseline environment. And yeah, heat exposure alone can cause facial flushing, blood vessel widening, and sudden warm episodes. And the sulfur compounds have known effects for eye irritation, headaches, dizziness, vascular effects, possible flushing sensations. So you get a hot, irritated feeling in the face and eyes, increased blood flow to the skin. So, yes, the miners also got the flushing. So, when miners sought help, especially in earlier decades, symptoms were often minimized or attributed to heat, smoking, or general fatigue. Subtle or subjective symptoms like flushing were often not recorded or considered nonspecific because the medical documents focus on fatal outcomes like cancer and measurable lung damage. And they just really, transient symptoms like flushing, burning sensations, episodic reactions were just basically not even considered because many minors were not formally examined early on. Language barriers and access issues meant symptoms were underreported or generalized. Because what happened was the U.S. Public Health Department ran early screening and research programs, and that later transitioned into the Indian Health Service after 1955. They did conduct periodic exams, x rays, and lung studies. These were often research oriented, not continuous care. Many miners were examined intermittently, not treated longitudinally. And yeah, in all of these cases, like when they did all that blowing up over the Marshall Islands, they were over there secretly observing the people. The people didn't know that they were being, well, they would just show up, doctors and stuff, and just go around, and they didn't really say, "Oh, we're here to observe this." The people weren't that um, well, they were pretty native, okay? So they didn't know, they didn't understand what was going on. So these people showed up on a big ship and they started examining them and stuff. And then they showed up on the big ships again, examined them some more. So, yeah, they have a history of going around and secretly examining people while things are going on. All those doctors and researchers, right? So, all they had for medical services, these were often research oriented. Yes, they only had like the Indian Health Service, and that was small clinics near reservations. They were limited staffing equipment. They had one physician or rotating staff. Large travel distances. Many miners simply did not go because they were severely ill and couldn't travel there. They had other institutions, but nobody was specialized in occupational disease. They focused on acute care, not exposure tracking. So that was how they got away from not looking at any of that stuff. They just said, "Oh, we're only worried about lung cancer." And many early miners were primarily Navajo speaking. They had lack of trained interpreters, symptoms described in culturally specific ways. They were translated into simplified or incomplete medical notes. So, yeah, and there was a historical distrust of federal systems, different frameworks, yeah. So, anyway, so the system was built to capture tuberculosis, silicosis, and later radiation related lung cancer. It was not built to capture episodic symptoms, environmental irritation patterns, or early stage toxic exposure signals. So things like flushing, burning sensations, intermittent eye skin reactions were either collapsed into vague categories or not recorded at all. So even if minors experienced facial heat, redness, sudden hot episodes, the symptoms would have been described informally, probably dismissed as heat exposure or dehydration, rarely coded as a distinct clinical findings. The system was not designed to track what miners felt. It was designed to track what killed them. By the time the records got serious, the early warnings were already gone. So the records track cancer only. What they didn't track, what it felt like before the cancer, the heat, the burning, the dizziness, and the kind of symptoms that show up get dismissed and disappeared from the paperwork. What they did was they positioned this so everybody thought they were doing patriotic work, right? Come help America. We'll kill you for your efforts, but come help us now. So, yeah. And it gave this perception that, well, the government's here, everything's being taken care of, right? And that was completely not true. So, anyhow, I'm going to need to take a break here, so I'm going to put that on hold for a second. Okay, so where did sulfur first start to show up? Well, it started to show up in the eye irritation and the tearing. Sometimes I'll be walking along or just sitting here, and all of a sudden, it's not like crying tears. All of a sudden, water literally will just flush out of my eyes just randomly. So you get this eye irritation and this tearing. You get a burning throat and your lungs. You get skin irritation, sores, or slow healing lesions. You get headaches and dizziness. And what is interesting is these things all fluctuate. And that's why I think is the key to this being so devious, because you don't it's not consistent. Like one day I walked into my hallway and all of a sudden I got hit with an attack and I was down for the rest of the day because there was some pocket of something in that area. So yeah, there's different pockets around. That's what makes it really, really tricky. Some days my eyes feel okay. Other days my eyes are so dry I can hardly read anything. Um, so anyway, so all of the day-to-day stuff they just ignored, right? Um, and the uranium delayed often invisible damage like lung cancer years later, kidney damage, and radiation effects accumulate silently. So uranium they considered long-term, harder to connect. Sulfur immediate, easier to feel and observe. And also, sulfur can be transported into the home. Crazy, huh? The gases can absorb into clothing and hair, can linger in enclosed spaces, and fine sulfide dust can easily be carried home on boots, clothing, and skin. What I think is going on is this: there's something that's happening, obviously. That was an astute comment. There's something that's happening. The minute they hooked up that transformer to the smart meter in my property was the day I almost got taken down. Something triggered all of that. Things have not been the same inside the house. And I think it's that transformer and the heat and the smart meter. They're all working together. And then you mix it together with, they're actually mixing actual sulfur into our home gassing, which I'll have more about that later. But we're really surrounded by a whole lot of sulfur. So I'm kind of having a hard time thinking a lot of this is really uranium and not just sulfur. But anyway, so I'll keep going along here because at the end of the day, we're all going to have to kind of decide, is it sulfur? Is it uranium? What is it, right? Remember, sulfur and uranium both look alike also. So is this the biggest trick on the planet? I really do not know yet. So let me just keep reading here. So sulfur reacts in the air. It forms acids, and that's where you get this sulfuric acid mist. It irritates the eyes, skin, and the mucous membranes, and it can create localized hot spots in homes or rooms. Whereas uranium sits in the dust or the soil. Its main airborne danger, they say, is radon gas, okay? What radon and radiation exposure provided was something the legal system depended on, okay? Radon. They depended on a measurable exposure, radon levels, and mine conditions, and a specific disease, lung cancer, and a statistical validation link, minor cohort studies. So let me tell you just a quote here about radon. I found the best piece when I talked about radon in these mining communities before. I hadn't found these people, and they have, well, I have the link down below. Let me just read what they said. The scare campaign received worldwide condemnation from the global scientific community. The EPA intentionally fabricated some of its information and formally requested that authors refrain from providing all the pertinent information to the U.S. public. Although the EPA scaled back on its heavy handed rhetoric to this very day, it has made it clear that public policy and federal grants and financial allocations are much more important than facts. it is almost exclusively that the U.S. EPA drives the multi-million dollar radon freight train in the United States. So I have more about this radon stuff in a bit here, but radon is the key point here. So radon isn't even true. So you take out radon, and what do you have left? Well, I don't know. You got sulfur, right? So let me see here. So sulfur related patterns. You get fluctuating symptoms. Yes, that's very, very key because it's hard to pin down. Like the other day, I decided that after this particular show here today, I'm going to be changing my entire format. Does that mean I'm going to be doing nothing? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I have followed my instincts all along the way, and my instincts have always been directly 100% correct, right? I followed my instincts in 2019 when I decided to get out of the medical system. I followed my instincts when I decided to go and figure out how to use marijuana as treatment. I followed my instincts when I decided to not leave my house and just stay put. And everything has paid off. My instincts right now say you better plan for a different kind of a future. What I'm going to be doing is I have my two shows about the orphan trained children and the Department of Defense shows. They're already about 95% done. My plan is this: I plan to record them as quickly as I can. Will they be perfect? No, of course not. But I plan to get those shows recorded as quickly as I can. Then for the rest of it, I don't know. I just came up with a plan a couple of days ago, so I need time to think. But everything is going to ship. I'm just not really sure of exactly how. It's just that I'm getting today's show done. I'll get the next two shows down, and then we'll figure it out from there. But as it is right now, you could already start to tell my voice has changed a lot in the last couple of shows. I can no longer really talk and use my mouth normally. So, yeah, those sharp razor pans are really something else. But I will address what I'm doing for the pain at the very end of this. So let me get back to this. So the uranium stuff, okay, and the radon business. So sulfur related patterns, fluctuated symptoms. The irritation is focused on the eyes, the skin, and the breathing. It can mimic chemical burns, chronic inflammation conditions, and it's often dismissed as sensitivity, allergies, or anxiety. Look around you. All these people all around us, all this anxiety, allergies, and everything else. Huh, could be the sulfur. But the uranium they claim is longer, but then they claim it's cancer clusters and organ damage. So, and less day-to-day symptoms early on. Well, I have had these other symptoms early on all along. So in many mining regions, uranium ore is not pure. And this is where I got started on this entire thing. I thought, well, I'm just going to take a quick look at these native Indian files one more time, and I thought, oh, whoa, between the gas, they're putting sulfur in the gas in our homes, and they're also the uranium ore is not pure. So let me explain how that works. Uranium ore is not pure. It is commonly mixed with sulfide minerals, pyrites, etc., and mining processes release sulfur gases and acidic dust. And you add in poor ventilation, lack of protective equipment, and workers returning home in contaminated clothes, you get a continuous low dose sulfur exposure affecting entire families. So they keep saying that uranium exposure is long term, silent, high impact with cancer and radiation, and less immediate sensory warnings. But its sulfur exposure, they say, is immediate, irritating, systematic across households, highly noticeable, but often minimized or misattributed. Misattributed is a key word here. I think a lot of people are sick from sulfur, just at varying different degrees, but not going to go there right this second. But uh, so they claim that uranium was the headline and sulfur was just the everyday living stuff these people just had to endure. They claim that uranium and the radon business has a long latency, 10 to 30 years, and they claim that that ends in clear diagnosable outcomes like lung cancer or kidney damage. So, you can connect exposure, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Legal problem. Hard to prove a single specific energy caused by sulfur alone. And yeah, that's key also because you got all kinds of stuff going on. I got a sore on my face. I got anxiety. I got this. I got that. So yeah, but I think sulfur is the key, the root, but they don't ever want to bring it into the picture, right? They say that uranium claims fit the model courts understood. Identifiable disease, lung cancer, measurable exposure, radon levels, and mine conditions, statistical backing, cohort studies. So this created the compensable injuries categories and structured these settlements. So sulfur falls into the diffuse harm, burning eyes, skin lesions, breathing issues. They overlap with allergies, infections, and environmental irritation. And this can cause disputes over causation. Easier defense arguments are nonspecific symptoms, other environmental factors, and no permanent injury. So, uranium exposure was measured eventually by the radon levels in radiation dose modeling and worker cohorts tracked over time. Sulfur exposure was often poorly measured or not measured at all, treated as a nuisance, ventilation issue, and part of the mining condition. So yeah, I think that that whole distinction was key, and I'd have to say kind of on purpose, right? So how did this sulfur stuff travel home to the homes? So they say that uranium was also carried home in the dust and the radon in housing, but lawsuits focus on workers, not families. So they claim that, well, we're just going to focus on the workers. So the families, the workers carried these things home, got the families sick, but the lawsuits only focus on the workers. Another kind of questionable deal, right? So, because from a litigious standpoint, they felt like uranium offers higher damage cases, cancer clusters, clearer causation, stronger expert testimony, and precedent cases. Sulfur, they felt, could face lower payout potential, fragmented symptoms, higher burden of proof, and greater chance of dismissal. Well, I say just the opposite, right? I think this was rigged from the very beginning, but hey, don't take my word for it. I've given you all the information. Every place I looked is down below or over my website. I don't cover everything I list in my show notes, so it may pay you for take a look, but everything I've looked at doesn't seem to indicate that any of this stuff is true, right? So, and because of that framing, that frames what gets studied, what gets regulated, and what gets litigated. And they claim that uranium produced the lawsuits because it produced the kind of damages courts recognize, delayed, deadly, and measurable. Sulfur produced the sufferings people lived with every day, but not the kind of injury the system is built to compensate. So, let's talk about uranium deposits form in complex rock systems. In many mines, uranium as uranite sits alongside this thing called pyrite, Pyrite, or fool's gold. Uranium also has other sulfide materials, iron, copper, and lead sulfides. So instead of uranium plus sulfur added later, it's uranium ore body that already contains sulfur bearing minerals. So right from the very jump start, the uranium itself contains sulfur bearing minerals. So how much sulfur is actually present? Well, it's widely varies. They say that low sulfide deposits can be from 1 to 2%, but moderate can be 3 to 10%. And some high sulfide deposits can exceed 10 to 20%. So basically, right from the very beginning, the uranium can have up to 20% of sulfide content just to begin with, okay? Before they even do anything, that uranium is also has sulfur in there, right? And they say, well, the key issue isn't just how much sulfur is there, it's what happens when it's disturbed. When sulfur minerals are exposed to air, the oxygen, water, or heat, they undergo chemical reactions that produce sulfur related outputs. The sulfur dioxide, which is a respiratory irritant, the hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic gas, or the sulfide acid, which is corrosive, the acid mine drainage. So, the engine of acid mine drainage is what they call it. Pyrite, oxygen, and water equals sulfuric acid and dissolved metal. So it turns into some pretty crazy stuff, right? Even if the mine is labeled uranium, the working environment often includes broken sulfide rock, dust containing sulfur compounds, gas release during blasting and drilling. So workers are exposed to radiation, the uranium and the radon, and the chemical irritants, which are these sulfur compounds, at the same time. Sulfur isn't a minor additive, it can be a significant part of the ore body. The hazard is activated by mining activity, not just presence. So, uranium ore isn't pure uranium. It's part of a larger mineral system that often includes sulfides like pyrite. When mining breaks that system open, those sulfides react with air and water, releasing sulfur gases and acids that workers experience immediately. The uranium was a target, but the sulfur came with it, and that's what the miners actually felt first. So, mixed symptoms. Effects had to be acute. Yeah, they really, well, I don't understand how they got this passed, to tell you the truth. With all this sulfur, I'm not really sure how legally they've got this all worked up just to be uranium. Maybe because in people's minds already uranium was bad. I don't really know because sulfur is really a multiple compounds. Exposure fluctuates. That's where it's key. Symptoms overlap with common conditions. So the defense can then argue, well, it's nonspecific, it's temporary irritation and non-permanent disabling. So if sulfur exposure had been framed as a chronic multi-system injury affecting entire households with strong exposure data, yes, it would have been a much bigger picture, but they left the families out. So nobody knew how dangerous this stuff was, right? I mean, to me, it appears pretty dangerous if the guy is walking out of that mine. He's got enough stuff on him that he's going to be killing his family next. That that seems pretty dangerous to me, right? So it seems like there are a lot of reasons to leave the families out of this, right? Because A, that would probably cost them so much more money, and also if they exposed at this point all of the horrors these native Indians were going through, how would they ever be able to do mining in the future, right? So yeah, so they got all this crazy sulfur all over the place. So I don't know. I I am quite confused. Is it sulfur in my house? Is it uranium? What is it? And also one other thing that I asked for directly in my ears. Now remember, I'm not going to be going through a complete medical diagnosis here today with myself. This isn't about me. But there's certain things I don't plan on covering, like I have massive tumors all through my breasts and stuff. I'm not going to be giving you pictures of any of that. So my ears feel like, well, if you go into water and then later your ears feel a little bit squishy for a while, you can press on your ear and you kind of feel like water's floating around your ears. Well, that's what my ears feel like, okay, all the time. So what happens is this, is that it's the eustachian, Eustacia, Eustachia, tube inflammation. So you get this Estancia tube inflammation. And you get it because exposure to irritants, common in mining environments, sulfur compounds, metal dust, acidic particles. And what it does, it inflames your nasal passages, your sinuses, and your upper throat. And because this Eustachian tube connects your throat to your middle ear, and the resulting sensation is fluid in the ear, pressure fullness, muffled hearing, popping or imbalance. So, yeah, from the literature, they talk about gas exposure and musical irritation. And that, from the occupational literature, hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide, their known effects are burning sensation in the nose and the throat, irritation of moist tissues, inflammation of airways. The ear is indirectly affected because the entire upper airway system is connected. So, many exposed populations reported chronic sinus irritation, congestion without infection, pressure in the face and the head. This frequently produces referred pressure into the ears, liquid sensation without actually fluid buildup. So, yeah, here's another symptom that can make you sound and feel crazy, right? Because it doesn't happen all the time. But my ears have stayed consistently the same way. So, so if you think about it, let me see. There was no consistent record of actual fluid accommodation. Let me see. In environmental and occupational cases, this type of symptom often gets dismissed as sinus or allergy and treated in isolation and not connected to exposure history. So yeah, but in pattern form, you got air irritation, skin symptoms, neurological complaints, and ENT irritation. Becomes much harder to dismiss as a coincidence, right? It feels like fluid in the ear, but what's really happening is irritation and pressure moving through a connected system: nose, throat, sinus, and ear. The exposure doesn't stop at the lungs. It moves through everything that breath touches. So if someone reports ear fullness without infection, plus gas smells, irritation, or chronic symptoms, the pattern is more consistent with environmental or airborne irritant exposure, not a standalone ear condition. If someone reports facial flushing, ear pressure, irritation, breathing issue, that pattern aligns more with airborne irritants, sulfur gases, and industrial exposure, not uranium alone. They may call it flushing, but uranium supposedly doesn't show up that way. When the face burns, the eyes sting, and the ears feel full, you're usually looking at something in the air, not something buried in the bone. So, facial flushing is possible but nonspecific, not a defining or late stage uranium symptom. Much more consistent. Listen up very carefully. So, the facial flushing is not a defining or late stage uranium symptom. It's much more consistent with gas exposure and irritants and an inflammatory response. Yeah, so common triggers, gas leaks, even small, sulfur type compounds, mercaptans added to natural gas. And I'll be getting to those mercaptans in a bit here. Industrial or environmental irritants. So, yeah, your body can react to irritants by releasing histamine, flushing of the face, warm redness, sinus swelling, ear pressure. This often comes and goes, can be triggered by environmental, not just allergies. Yeah, sometimes when it's bad, my face will just turn just completely beet red. What I do at that point is go back into my room, I lay down, and I get my face in front of the fresh air. So, because it comes and goes, can be triggered by environment, not just allergies. So, and that eustachian tube gives you inflammation in your nasal passages and your upper throat. It affects the ear pressure regulation. So you get the fluid in the ear feeling, fullness and popping. So, yeah, and some exposures trigger sudden flushing, temperature changes in face, dizziness, or off feeling. This is the body reacting, not structural damage. What it does not match well. Uranium exposure does not cause episodic facial flushing, does not come and go like this, is primarily kidney toxic, long term accumulation. When you combine flushing face, ear pressure fullness, history of gas smell, or exposure concerns, that pattern is much more consistent with airborne irritants than anything else. That is the key clue. Episodic symptoms often mean exposure is intermittent or your body is reacting in waves. And what do those smart meters do? They pulsate waves, right? Examples: HVAC cycles, appliance use, environmental shifts, and building relate exposure. When symptoms turn off and on, the source usually does too. The body isn't randomly flushing, it's reacting to something that's coming and going. Most consistent explanation: chronic facial flushing disorder. Could be often like a rosacea type. Why this fits? Well, persistent background redness, episodes of intense flushing, triggered by environmental irritants, heat, indoor air, stress, certain exposures. The rosacea or rosacea like condition involves overactive facial blood vessels, heightened inflammatory response. So the same triggers can cause to my ears. You get the sinus inflammation, the eustachian tube dysfunction, which gives that fluid and ear pressure feeling. So this is likely one connected system: face, sinuses, and ear pressure. Flare patterns strongly suggest trigger exposure, not random disease progression. So yeah, something is changing in the air around here and it's in different kinds of pockets. And that is actually, if you're looking for a great eugenics tool, sulfur really fits the bill, right? It comes and it goes. You can't really describe it. One day your sinuses feel like heck. The next day, well, your ears feel like you're floating underwater. Well, the next day your eyes are flushing wet. Oh, and then the next day my eyes are so dry I can't even see straight. Oh, and the next day I might walk out of my room and everything is blurring. Everything changes all the time. So you start to feel like, am I feeling crazy? Or is something around here that is going on, right? Something is in the air in this house. And I can guarantee you, my friends, that something got started when they hooked up that transformer to the smart meter on my property. Everything got going all at once. So let me put this on hold for a while, get some rest. I'll be back as soon as I can. And by the way, I'm not all freaked out about this. First of all, if I wanted to start crying about stuff, crying is the worst thing I want to do because crying crying will upset the pets and stuff, but crying will make my eyes so much worse. So if I feel like moaning to myself, no, I don't start crying because I know it's going to make my eyes work. Do I start yelling? No, I don't yell because if I open my mouth too wide, my face hurts. So, here's what I do. I tell myself, hey, buckle up, buttercup. This stuff is going to get real. We're here at the greatest time of the planet on the planet Earth, okay? We're here at the most important time of all, the final battle between good and evil. If you think for 1 second I'm going to set this out for any reason, you got to be kidding me because that is not how it's going to work. I will keep writing, or I will keep reading, or I will keep writing things that you will have to read for me. I will keep moving no matter what because remember, this is just a game board. We're here to figure out how we get to this finish line. Figure out how to crawl through the finish line. Do what you have to figure it out, but figure it out because this is not real. All the stuff they're doing against us is to break us down. It's not just physically they're killing us, they're killing people mentally. People are too poor to buy gas. People can't do this. People can't do that. Learn to be a fighter. Fight on your feet. Get that. If you can grab them by the left foot, then punch them in the right. You got to get up. You got to keep stumbling to your feet. That is the way it has to work. So yeah, that's what I tell myself. I tell myself, hey, buttercup, you better buckle up because it's just going to get real. So yes. I do what I can. I'm doing what I can to keep moving along. And I will talk about the healing part, not the healing part, but the way that I maintain without the pain at the very end here. But yeah, I tell myself this is the biggest, most extensive adventure any of us have ever been on. We finally get to battle the evil people that have been in our sights for a very long time, or the last couple of 100 years. This is the big battle. Don't just waltz off the game board and, I can't take it. I can't take it. My eyes hurt. I can't breathe. Listen, when this is all over, you leave this ugly, battle body behind. You go back to home. You'll go where you belong. This is just a training skill. We come from a very advanced society. This is just a scramble to see how well we survive. So, speaking of surviving, I need to take a nice long break here, but I will be back because this show will get done today. So, hang on there. I'll be back. Okay, let's continue on. Before I get started, over on my website, I've been working for a long time on this section called Top Pods. If you click on Top Pods, they will download for you now automatically, and the title will be intact. So all of the shows that are pretty much ones you want to pay attention to will be there. And all you have to do is click download. And earlier you had to click download and then redo the name, but now you click download, you got the name, you got it all. So go to Top Pods, and the last 6 shows I still have to update, but you can pretty much go through that list and just click download anything you want to your devices. So in this segment, I'm going to be talking about this research that, well, the Alzheimer's research, well, appears a little sketchy to me. What I find interesting is people will look at this and think, yeah, that does look sketchy. But then they'll look at that Bible and they'll think, nope, nothing wrong with this. So it is basically a lot of it is a big lie. And then I'll also be talking in this segment about how they're adding gas to our, how they're adding sulfur to our home gas system. That one really threw me for a loop. Maybe I'm the only person who didn't know that, but they've been spiking our home heating gas with sulfur. Gee, imagine that. So I will be getting back to that in a bit, but just to explain why this stuff is so confused and the idea about radiation seems to be, well, lacking, right? So we have NASA and the space program, right? So let me just give you a little bit about here because it includes radiation and I want to insert it here. First of all, we have a thing called April Fool's Day. It became a trick day because of calendar changes and older spring traditions where people play jokes during seasonal festivals. So April Fool's Day jokes have been around for a long time, right? And let's talk about dragons. Dragons appear in the Bible as symbols of evil, sin, and destruction. In the book of Revelation, Satan is called a dragon in the New Testament. It is symbolic of Satan's real evil power. It also symbolizes the power of God, who is really the only one who defeats the beast. So, April Fool's Day, right? And we have this dragon thing in the picture, right? Well, I've talked about the Nassau thing in the past, not going to go there specifically, but there's a point that I want to bring up here. April 2026 is the 66th anniversary of Tyros, the first television image of Earth from space. So the first image we got from space was called Tyros, Tiros 1. And it was taken on April 1, 1960. Remember April's Fool's Day, right? So Tyros 1 was NASA's first weather satellite, and its images helped prove that satellites could be used for weather forecasting. Okay, so it was done on April Fool's Day, right? April 1, 1960, a day known for deception. The first true image of Earth from space provided something undeniable. We were no longer guessing about our world, we were seeing it. So NASA released the very first images taken by astronauts recently on this thing they're calling the Artemis 2. And this is this show you the technology and how it's improved, right? So we have these pictures. First ones were released on April 1, 1960. NASA just released some first images on their way to the moon. And who took the pictures? Well, this mission commander named Reed Wiseman. Wiseman. There's always little jokes piled in here, right? So, mission commander Reed Wiseman, using his personal computing device, a tablet that includes a camera, and gave the latest view of Earth. So, the latest view of Earth was taken from a tablet which had a camera. Now, they have like, I don't know, $20 billion budget, right? So, who's running NASA right now? Well, it's being run by somebody who Donald Trump put in place, a man named Jared Isaacman. Not going to go into his whole history, but he has a rather colorful past, right? He's like one of these kid geniuses that, at 16 was discovering the world and all this kind of stuff, right? He had a company called Draken International. Have you heard the word Draken before? Well, if you haven't, let me remind you. So the guy running NASA now was the founder of a company called Draken International. Okay. His current role, 15th administrator of NASA, nominated by Donald Trump, confirmed December 2025. So he came from a company called Draken, right? The name Draken translates to dragon in Swedish. It is often perceived as powerful and fierce. The dragon also, they have dragons right between the city of London and Greater London. And also, NASA named the Apollo. Remember the Apollo, the picture of the first Apollo picture? That was named the Greek version of the Freemason god named Lucifer. And so, all in all, this new guy has a $27.5 billion budget. You think it's really about going to space? Or is this the biggest hoax around, right? Let me tell you a little bit about this calendar. In the 1500s, highly suspicious time, right? Much of Europe switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. Before before New Year was often celebrated around late March to April 1st. After that, the New Year was moved to January 1st. People who kept celebrating the old New Year in early April were mocked and called April Fools. That ridicule include pranks and tricks. Long before calendars changed, many cultures had spring festivals built around chaos and humor. India had one. Medieval Europe had the Feast of Fools traditions. So obviously, April Fools is definitely tied to fools, right? Lies, tricks, deception, right? So interesting that they name the Nassau pictures on April the 1st, right? So I have about three articles down below that go into all of the intricate parts of this trick, but I'm only going to cover a few of them here. So, this is where we get confused because in order to get to the moon the first time, they had to have passed the Van Allen radiation belts, okay? And what they're saying is this. Well, they're saying, well, they didn't really sit in them, but what they're saying is they're not claiming that the Artemis has landed on the moon yet. That's coming next, okay? But what they're saying is this, well, we can get through those belts because we do this. Well, we take a fast angled trajectory, then the time inside the belt is very short, on the order of hours. So, starting at an altitude of 1,000 miles until at least 15,000 miles above the Earth, NASA claims that deadly bands of radiation appear known as VARBs, Van Allen radiation belts, or VARBs. Any astronaut traveling through the VARB would, within minutes, have been killed or rendered seriously ill by the radiation. See, they're acting like, well, yeah, they got through it because they angled the trajectory and they moved fast. And they're saying thing about the next landing. Yeah, they're gonna just angle the thing. Well, why did the people from Chernobyl all get in trouble when they exited Chernobyl after that little blast, right? They all had wounds and stuff like that. Well, I guess maybe they didn't run fast enough. So this claim that, well, you can just shoot through the radiation faster and it won't get you is pretty much insane, right? To survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this deadly radiation field so as to reach the moon and then return, a 2-meter thick layer of lead shielding would have been needed to protect the astronauts from the radiation. But the Saturn rocket carried off carried all the vehicles or the props used by Apollo, and it was already the size of a battleship. So any additional weight in the form of a lead barrier shield would have made it impossible for the Saturn V rocket to take off from the ground in the name of merely well protecting the astronauts. Until his death in 2006, even James Van Allen, the guy they named it after, himself continued to state that humans cannot make it through the barb unless enormous lead protections are provided for both directions, exit and re-entry. According to this person, Dover, the space suits it made for the Apollo astronauts did not provide any protection against radiation, heat, or cold. The fact that none of the astronauts was injured or killed by radiation, heat, or cold in space or on the moon provided beyond a doubt that the Apollo hoax was shot in film studios. In the 1990s, thousands of computer users opened Adobe Photoshop and were now, for the first time, able to prove that the Earthrise photo was in fact a fake. By simply increasing the exposure level, you can clearly see that NASA actually stuck a rectangle, quote unquote, Earth poster on the background of its 1968 photo and then released the resulting faked composite as its Earthrise photo. But even today, in 2021, there has never been a single photo of the Earth taken from space. So please find me the very first real photo. And then there's hundreds of these examples, okay? Those three articles I posted are actually very fascinating and just the level of deception and also the numbers what the number two, all this stuff is all in those articles. But let me read one more. Dr. Raoul van Makule of the Leiden Observatory in the Netherlands said the moon landings never took place and were in fact filmed by director Stanley Kubrick on a soundstage in Huntsville, Alabama, shortly after Kubrick completed his movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. The Zionist power elite blackmailed him on account of his brother Raoul being a suspected communist through involvement in the U.S. Communist Party. Even NASA astronauts like Dr. Brian O'Leary stated that the Apollo missions were a hoax. In revenge for his revelations, Dr. Brian O'Leary was murdered in 2011 by the Central Lack of Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. The CIA gave the very healthy Dr. Brian O'Leary a massive dose of fast-acting cancer. Now, is that true or not? I don't really know. I read it just because I'm feeling like a joke, right? So, no, did they kill the guy? Yeah, maybe. So, Draco is another name for Lucifer or Satan. Okay, let's keep all this stuff straight, right? Draco, Draken, all this stuff, right? And if you forget any of this stuff, all you have to do is go over to Yandex.com, and just type in is Draken Dragon, and you'll find all the information right there. So, anyways, if there are doubts these days that human can actually achieve this feat, for example, the following question appeared on Quora on August 23rd, 2018. When will the existence of the Van Allen belt and our inability to penetrate its harsh radiation with today's technology force NASA to admit it faked the moon landing? Some people believe we never went to the moon because of the existence of the Van Allen radiation belts. The idea is that any astronauts en route to outer space has to pass through these belts, and in so doing, they would receive a lethal dose of radiation. These belts are the result of Earth's magnetic field working like a magnet trap or an accelerator, confining the particles of the solar, mostly wind, and sometimes accelerating them on their orbits within the belts to nearly the speed of light. These belts are shaped like two nested donuts. Their sizes change depending on solar activity and sometimes on how we model them. The inner belt starts at an altitude of 600 to 1,600 kilometers, according to different sources, and extends to 9,000 to 13,000 kilometers. There is a gap between these belts called the slot region, which is generally devoid of energetic particles. Sometimes a third transient appears. So, yes, the radiation belts are not the only structures surrounding Earth. So, yeah, they have the inner, they have the outer. Too much detail for this second, but yes, they have these radiation belts that cannot be penetrated. In the 1950s, as ideas for space exploration were picking up, nobody knew what the environment of the part of space surrounding Earth. Space, they never knew what it was really like. Many believed this region to be mostly a vacuum. So yeah, in the 1950s, U.S. James A. Van Allen, then chairman of the Upper Atmosphere Rocket Research Panel, launched hundreds of raccoons, they called them. He was investigating high altitude near the magnetic poles. So yeah, he discovered them, and they're still there. So they've X-rayed them. They've done all that stuff, right? They know for a fact there's these radiation belts hampering getting to the moon. So anyway, so yeah, I have all of those information down below. Let me see. The first recommendations for dealing with the Van Allen belts on a possible mission to the moon came in the summer of 1960 at a NASA group meeting. They believed they could do this or that, but then they did some tests and said, no, it is nuclear. We cannot get through it. So, yeah, that is exactly how it worked. And I also have an official letter by this Van Allen guy. So, what they're doing, I think, now remember, I'm just guessing on this part because this Van Allen um, belt has been so well documented. I mean, I could now tell you more about it, and you would be dizzy and fuzzy and begging me to stop. So, because the Van Allen thing has been so well documented, it makes it a little bit harder to lie about. Well, it's going to kill you if you go to the moon, right? So that's where they came up with this thing about, well, we're going to just angle the rocket in this direction, and then what we're going to do is we're going to shoot through really fast. Well, that isn't even close to how radiation all works. Because if that were how it works, then why didn't those people in Chernobyl run faster? They could have shot past all that stuff, right? So I guess we can blame it on them. Oh, hold on one second here. I realized I wasn't plugged in. Let me see here. Yeah, so anyhow, look at if you're still not convinced the moon landing is fake, well, I've given you 3 articles down below to go take an even more extensive look. And then if you're still confused, well, I don't know why you're confused. But anyway, so let me get back to our point over here and put that on hold for a second. Okay, so I talked about the top pod section has been updated. You can download all you want from there. The proper titles will be attached to them. In this section, I'm going to be talking about how they added sulfur to our gas in our homes. That really shocked me. Maybe I'm the only person that didn't know it. I don't really know. But anyways, and I'm going to talk more about this Alzheimer's research. Very, very suspicious. But so let me finish up about this stuff on my face. Okay. It isn't random redness. When it builds slowly, then spikes, the body is reacting to something again and again until the baseline never fully resets. My patterns of my symptoms form a coherent pattern, most consistent with vascular flushing disorder and environmental triggers. My ear sensation supports a sinus pressure connection. The come and go piece is the biggest clue. Something external is likely influencing it. And that's the part that made it hard, I'm sure, for these poor people to report it because everything, and you really start thinking, because remember, you're starting to get fuzzy in the head, you're getting a little bit delusional, and then you see these things coming and going, and you're thinking, yesterday I went to walk in the kitchen and everything, well, it's like fuzzy, like you're looking at like a black and white movie. And then you blink your eyes a couple of times, and hey, everything's fine. So you start thinking, did I really see that? So here's what the mining record showed. Across uranium, sulfur, and hard rock mining literature, and that includes these legal cases, The consistent symptoms are this: respiratory irritation, burning throat and coughing, eye irritation, redness and tearing, skin damage, ulcers, non healing lesions, neurological complaints, headaches and fatigue, chronic sinus issues. You do not see facial flushing listed as a headline subject. When flushing does show up indirectly, it's from the skin irritation. In some occupational reports, workers exposed to irritant gases or dust show redness of exposed skin, face, and neck, burning sensation. This is typically called erythema, which means skin redness that can look like flushing, especially if it comes and goes. In mining environments with sulfur compounds, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide, documented effects include irritation of moist tissues, eyes, nose, and skin, facial discomfort or redness. This is closer to chemical irritation, to redness, not vascular flushing in the classical sense. What happens is you get the dry eyes and the foggy vision, and they come from tear film disruption, inflammation of the eye surface. This causes blurred, hazy vision that comes and goes, burning or dryness, sensitivity to air, heat, or irritants. The fog is often the tear film breaking down, not permanent vision loss. Then you get the ocular rosacea, facial vascular condition, persistent facial redness, flushing episodes, dry, irritated eyes, fluctuating foggy vision. Ocular rosacea involves inflammation of oil glands in the eyelids, unstable tear film, facial blood vessel reactivity. My pattern can be triggered or worsened by exposure, including gas odors, combustion products, sulfur type compounds, or odorants in natural gas, or indoor air quality issues. And that is exactly what's going on. It is actually increasing. But I think that several things are slowing it down. But the fact that it continues to decrease really means that something is in my air. And I think that something is that smart meter and that transformer. So when the eyes dry out, the face flushes, and the ears feel full, you're not looking at separate problems. You're looking at one system reacting to something in its environment. Sulfur type exposures often fluctuate with environment, depend on airflow, appliances, and time of day. And this should pay attention to because they say the fluctuation happens with appliances. Well, what causes appliance to fluctuate? Well, smart meters. Your smart meters are going off millions of times a day, causing fluctuations. Maybe that's a connection. Because they say to turn on and off the things to see if it's still as bad. Yeah, there is something in those smart meters and those transformers. So sulfur gases don't just affect the lungs, they hit the eyes, the skin, and the sinuses all at once. When the eyes dry out, the face reddens, and the ears feel full, that's the whole upper airway system reacting. And yeah, systems work worsen in specific rooms, tied to appliances, occur with noticeable odor. I had odor a few years ago and actually called the gas company. No, nothing was going on, but I'll get to that in a minute here. So my systems, my symptoms are definitely consistent with irritant exposure patterns. Sulfur type gases are one plausible category. So anyhow, so I've got all those symptoms one on one, right? Um, And here's the other thing: staying strictly grounded, common categories include gas stoves, furnaces, and water heaters. They can release low level irritants even without obvious danger signs. Now we're talking, right? Stoves, furnaces, and water heaters. So that's when I ran across these odorants and I thought, wait a minute, odorants? What are they talking about? And then here's the facts. Natural gas odorants, they're called mercantile, I can't even pronounce it. It's called mercantaptans, and it gives you a sulfur-based smell. And I about did a backflip on this one. So they're called mercaptans, mercaptans. Even in small amounts, this could irritate the eyes, the sinuses in sensitive individuals. And also, multiple things can produce the same pattern. Neo-behavioral symptoms have been documented across mining and gas exposure literature. Workers reported irritability, irritability, nervousness, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, and mood changes. In modern terms, a lot of this maps to anxiety-like symptoms. So, when hydrogen sulfide studies and occupational reports describe agitation, anxiety, confusion, dizziness, and headaches at low to moderate exposure levels, symptoms can be intermittent and hard to pin down. And in chronic exposure environments, in mining communities especially, uranium miners, sulfur mining, there are reports of nervous system complaints, psychological disturbance, sleep disruptions. These were often underreported, attributed to stress or working conditions rather than exposure. Why anxiety shows up in these cases. Certain gases and toxins can affect the central nervous system, alter neurotransmitter balance, producing anxiety, agitation, on edge feeling. Irritants can also affect breathing subtly. Even mild disruptions, body stress response, triggers anxiety sensations, panic like symptoms. Workers often experience unexplained symptoms, inconsistent exposure, leading to psychological stress layered on physical effects. In many cases, symptoms were labeled as stress, nerves, or psychological, but later understanding suggests some of these may have been physiological triggers, not purely psychological ones. When the body is reacting to something in the air, the mind doesn't stay untouched. What gets labeled as anxiety can be part of the same reaction, not a separate problem. So, anxiety like symptoms are documented in exposure populations. They are usually recorded as neurobehavioral effects, nervous system symptoms, and the strongest link is irritant gases, especially hydrogen sulfide. Often they're misattributed or minimized in the early records. So, yes, then I was looking around and I saw that they're having these all these testing, right? They say, "Oh, we've done some testing." So I thought, well, what exactly tests have you done? Well, they did no cancer testing in animals. I would think that would be key, right? So the odorants used in natural gas or these mercantapans have been studied for toxicity, including in animals, but not in the way that we're thinking. Mercantans, or actually sulfur, are added in very tiny concentrations, just enough for detections. They are not intended to cause injury, but some people report sensitivity, headaches, and irritation, especially if exposure is prolonged or there is a leak. Mercaptans are gases or vapors at room temperature. They disperse quickly in open air, but can accumulate in enclosed spaces. Humans detect them as parts per billion levels, extremely sensitive. If you smell it, it doesn't mean a large amount is present. It means your nose is very sensitive to it. Sulfur isn't just one thing, the effect depends on the compound. So, actually, This was all to help us out. Why do you think I always say that evil has to come packaged as help? Somehow, and this part does not connect in my brain even one bit. So maybe it will in yours. So I'll go ahead and read all this stuff for you. But this does not add up to me for a second because what they're basically saying is when I start saying, well, wait a minute, why is sulfide in the gas in our home heating system? Well, we're doing that to help you out because I guess the logic is that if you smell rotten eggs or gas or sulfur in your house, they know the limit's too high. And like I said, I am foggy about why or how this even happened. Okay. So, so hydrogen sulfide is the main concern found in oil, gas operations, sewage, and some mining. High exposure is a known neurotoxin. Effects can include memory problems, attention deficits, mood changes, in severe cases, long term cognitive impairment. Workers with significant sulfur exposure have shown persistent neurological symptoms. Some researchers describe this as toxic euxodophia, not classic dementia, but it can look very similar. So, sulfur dioxide and air pollution, chronic exposure. Some studies link long term exposure to cognitive decline, increased risk of neurogenetic disease. This is usually population level risk, not a direct singular cause. So these things are called mercantans. They're called natural gas odorants. A normal At normal utility levels, they're not linked to dementia. But of course, they've never done any studies, so how they're saying this, I don't know. High or repeated exposure may cause headaches, irritation, possible short-term neurological symptoms. And this is what they say they agree to, right? They say, it's just such a tiny amount. What are you complaining about? Just a few little minor things. We had to put this sulfur in the gas just to help you out. And then uranium has two components: chemical toxicity, heavy metal, or radiation. And radiation is mostly low level externally and higher if it's internalized. So the primary target is the kidneys. Secondary is possible neurological effects. So, yeah, some studies, memory issues, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so evidence for direct dementia causation is limited. Effects are more consistent with chronic toxic exposure. So, there are two different categories. There is the neurological dementia, which is the Alzheimer's, Lewy body, etc. And then there's also the progressive disease ridden one. So, and there's also toxic brain injury from environmental exposure. That is caused by chemicals, gases, and metals. Can mimic dementia symptoms, memory loss, confusion, personality change, but mechanism is different. Yeah, I'm not so sure that it's different, but I'll just stick with what they're saying here. So, bottom line, hydrogen sulfide or sulfur gas can cause long term brain injury at high exposure levels. Airborne sulfur pollution may increase cognitive decline risk over time. These mercantapes or the gas odorants are not linked to dementia in typical use. And uranium can affect cognition with chronic exposure, but is not a common or primary cause of dementia, or so they say. And here's the question that I keep circling. Could chronic environmental exposure create symptoms that look like dementia? Yes, under certain conditions, especially with repeated exposure, poor ventilation, occupation, or environmental sources. But proving that link in a specific case requires exposure history, environmental testing, and medical evaluation. So yeah, I I I I wonder what would be like in my house. Well, I wouldn't have lived to it, but if I my first instinct early on was put fans in my windows, and that was way before I had any idea anything was going on. So I followed my instincts and put fans in my windows. I can't imagine. Well, I wouldn't be alive if I hadn't have put fans in my windows. So I certainly hope your ears are perking up and you're really seriously thinking about putting fans in your windows. So anyhow, so they claim that what they're saying about the uranium mining versus sulfur mining. I'm not really convinced that there's any real big difference here, right? Because they say that Alzheimer's is diagnosed based on symptoms first, especially early on: memory loss, disorientation, and behavioral change. Those same symptoms can be caused by toxic exposure, chronic inflammation, or hypoxia, which is low oxygen at the cellular level. So toxic exposure can look like Alzheimer's clinically, even when the underlying cause is environmental. So, yeah, I mean, what is what, right? They say that not every case looks like all blah, 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 blah. Okay, so yeah, um, so let's take a look at this Alzheimer research. A major 2006 study claimed a specific protein, the amyloid beta, causes memory loss. That paper became very influential and helped drive years of research and funding. So, what's the problem? Well, later, investigators covered by Retraction Watch found possible image data manipulation in that paper and some related work. Other papers in the same research area have also been questioned. That one line of research helped shape billions of dollars in Alzheimer's studies. If it's flawed, it may have pushed science too heavily in one direction, delayed other ideas being explored. One of the most important Alzheimer papers is under serious question. It exposed weaknesses in how research gets published and funded. The field is now reevaluating. They were pushing the field toward the one main explanation of Alzheimer's. The direction was the amyloid hypothesis. They said Alzheimer's is primarily caused by amyloid. It's amyloid beta plaques building up in the brain. Remove the plaques and symptoms should improve. That idea became the dominant model for decades. That led to research focus narrowed. Huge share of funding went to amyloid proteins, plaque formation, lab models built around amyloid. Other areas got less attention, like inflammation, vascular damage, blood flow issues, environmental toxic exposures, metabolic factors like insulin resistance in the brain. Drug companies focus on drugs to remove amyloid plaques. And the result, well, the result is many drugs cleared plaques, but patients didn't improve much. So, early influential papers brought the funding. Funding brought more amyloid studies. More studies brought more publications supporting the same idea. This creates a feedback loop, even if the core assumption is incomplete. They treated amyloid as a main cause when it may be only one piece or even a byproduct of other processes. So where is the field now? It is shifting toward a multi-factor model, including brain inflammation, blood vessel damage, immune system dysfunction, aging process, possible environmental contributors. So when people say it pushed science in one direction, what they mean is this. For years, Alzheimer's research was built around the idea that amyloid plaques were the central cause, and that focus may have crowded out other explanations. They didn't just study Alzheimer's, they narrowed it. One theory, one target, one pipeline. And when the drugs worked on paper but not on people, the crack started to show. Now, where does this sound familiar with? Let me think for a minute here. They study something, they narrow it down, and then they come up with some drugs. And maybe those drugs work, maybe they don't work. So let's break this down a little bit. Early 2000s, the research phase, lab work begins on amyloid beta proteins. The focus was finding which form might cause memory loss. 2006, a key paper was published. A specific amyloid beta protein assembly in the brain impairs memory. It claimed that a specific protein, I think it's AB56, causes memory problems. It becomes highly influential. 2006 to 2021, 15 years. 15 years went by. Thousands of studies were cited or built on this idea. Drug development focuses on removing the amyloid. Billions in funding flow into this pathway. Problems exposed, 2022. Independent investigators flag possible image manipulation, duplicate altered data, covered by Retraction Watch and major media. 2023 to present, papers reviewed, some corrected, confidence in that specific finding weakened. Field begins shifting to multiple causes, not just amyloid. What's the bottom line? For 15 to 16 years, from 2006 to 2022, before major public challenge, the paper helped shape research the entire time. It wasn't caught immediately. It took over a decade. And they're doing that now too. That they came up with something. Oh, I guess it was Joe Rogan came up with. He got a hold of Trump, and then they say, well, I don't really like Trump. Of course you do. They're all the same. But anyway, so Rogan gets a hold of Trump and talk about, oh, I don't know, one of these psychedelics for helping with um, depression. So now we're getting medical advice from creepy, stupid podcasters like Joe Rogan. So he gets a hold of Trump, and Trump says, "Hey, not a problem. Do you want FDA approval? We'll get it for you." It took a week, and people are now cheering that. Now, weren't these the same people that were all up in arms over this COVID vaccine happened so quickly? The same people shouting about these other vaccines. Now they're cheering that you can get these other things approved within a week for mental health. Everybody misses the main thing. When all these maniacs on social media keep blabbing about vaccines, yeah, a lot of them are saying, I've never take that COVID vaccine. But when you really listen to them, they're all really pro-vaccine, right? They'll say things like, but I'd give that polio vaccine because only those lunatic anti-vax people go against the polio. Well, listen, geniuses, it took less than 24 hours to approve that polio vaccine you guys all love so much. So what is it? You love those vaccines? You love quick approval, or don't you? You can't have it all different kinds of ways now, can you? So, yeah, they were applauding Trump pushing the FDA in a week to get this all approved. The same people that were criticizing. Oh boy, are we surrounded by some very intelligent people. And I said that as a complete joke if you didn't catch on there. So anyway, so a key Alzheimer's study guided research for about 15 years before serious questions about its data surfaced. So, yeah, um, what happened was the whole thing got started. This key paper that got the whole thing going came out of, let me see, did it come out of a corporation? Did it come out of big pharma? Oh, no, you guessed it wrong. It came out of a university, University of Minnesota. This lab produced the AB56 paper that later came under scrutiny. The lead author was Sylvian Lesne. May they live in hell. The senior lab director, Karen Ash. May she burn in hell. Okay, so yeah, that was the whole thing that got this whole started. They say that it did not start the whole idea, but okay, let's play along for a second. They say the amyloid hypothesis goes back decades earlier. So yeah, they took it from somebody who cooked it up earlier is what it really means, right? 1980s to 1990s, George Glenner helped identify amyloid in plaques. John Hardy proposed the amyloid cascade hypothesis in the early 1990s. That's what originally got it going. So, yeah, so then institutional backing. It started with the University of California, San Diego. And of course, it worked with the Veterans Administration. The only reason I think they have a veterans hospital is so they can test on these poor veterans. So, in the late 1980s, this person, George Glenner, helped identify the protein amyloid beta as a major component of Alzheimer's brain plaques. This was a foundational discovery. It put amyloid on the map. And then there was another guy, John Hardy. Maybe remember and memorize all of these names of these evil creeps who came up with this stuff. John Hardy, a British neuroscientist and geneticist, he came from the University College of London. So he previously worked at the Imperial College London Hospital. Yeah, early 1990s. This dude helped propose the amyloid cascade hypothesis. So, yeah, Glenner in the 1980s identified the substance, amyloid in plaques. Hardy in the 1990s argued it drives the disease. And then these other geniuses just picked it up and ran with it from there. And here we are. So then when I read that they had these pills, I was like, well, wait a minute. How do they have pills if the studies didn't work out? Well, that's when the story kind of gets kind of good here. So, but who funded all this before I get to the pill part? Well, the National Institute of Health funded it, and the Veterans Affairs funded it. They funded the basic science, they funded early Alzheimer's, uh, universities where the work was done, University of California in San Diego, University College of London, and other major research universities globally. Basically, they just cook this stuff up at the university level. Big pharma takes over, and then boom, it's killing all of us, right? So they hosted the labs, they ran the experiments, they trained the researchers, and then we have the Alzheimer's Association, a disease-focused foundation. That role was to get seed funding, public awareness, and advocacy to help drive more government funding. So from the 1980s to the 1990s, we had the amyloid identifier, that Glenner freak. Then we had the genetic link proposed by Hardy. Then we had the government funding increases steadily. Then phase two, the 2000s, where they accelerated it. Then high impact paper, that 2006 one, amyloid becomes the central target. And then NIH directs large portions of Alzheimer funding toward amyloid research. Universities and lab follow the funding. Then pharma enters heavily. Major companies, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Biogen, Roche, and ESOB, they develop drugs to remove amyloid plaques. And that's where I started thinking, well, wait a minute. How did they remove the drugs? And that's when I came up with all this other stuff. So they developed drugs to remove amyloid plaques. They funded clinical trials, which was a very expensive phase. So then phase four became the multi-billion-dollar pipeline. Alzheimer's became one of the largest drug markets in development. Estimates tens of billions of dollars spent over decades. Individual large scale trials can cost hundreds of millions each. Why everything concentrated on amyloid? Because government funding followed early findings. Top journals reinforced the theory. Pharma needed a clear, targetable mechanism. Amyloid gave them a measurable target, like those plaques. This created a self reinforcing system. So, yeah, public money, or the NIH, built the foundation. Universities executed the research, and pharma scaled into drug development. Over time, this became a multi-billion-dollar research and drug pipeline centered on amyloids. So taxpayers funded the theory, universities proved it, and pharma turned it into a billion-dollar drug pipeline, all aimed at one target, the amyloid. Well, too bad the amyloid wasn't the main problem, right? So, oh boy, so many crimes, so little time. So big pharma, how much money is being made? It's more complicated because most Alzheimer's drugs failed for years. Only recently have approved drugs started generating revenue. And yeah, they approved these drugs based on, well, I don't really know. Another foggy area here. So I have the list of the drugs. Let me see. Let me read them. Current or recent Alzheimer drug revenues. Um, this one drug, Lemecki, 2024 to 2025 was a ramp up phase. early revenue, hundreds of millions, and they're projected billions annually. This other drug called Aduhelm, highly highly controversial approval, limited uptake, commercial failure relative to expectations. So the Alzheimer drug market, and there's lots of information available about all this stuff. 10 to 20 billion dollars annually is the future estimate. But pharma has spent tens of billions on failed trials. Alzheimer's has been called one of the highest failure rate areas in medicine. So historically, more money lost than made. And now with new drugs, they're starting to turn into a major revenue stream. So yeah, so I don't understand the new drugs, but let me get over to my next section here. So yeah, so Alzheimer's research went from a $500 million program to nearly $4 billion a year in federal funding, while pharma spent decades chasing treatments and is only now beginning to see real revenue. Right now, the companies best positioned to make the most money from Alzheimer's drugs over the next 5 to 10 years are Eli Lilly and this other Biogen. They already have the only two FDA approved. I'm sorry, it's not funny, but something about this just strikes me as so insane that I just have to start laughing. So yeah, so these two companies, Eli Lilly and Biogen, they have the two FDA-approved anti-amyloidogen disease modifying drugs on the market. And the current leaders are not hard to identify because they are already generating sales. Lilly reported in Q4 2025 about 109 million. But yeah, they're looking at billions is what they're looking at. Uh, why these companies have the inside track is straightforward. They already have approved products, physician awareness, infusion infrastructure, and a reimbursement paid through Medicare. Even though Medicare coverage still requires registry style evidence collection and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I have all the financial if you want to take a look at it. But yeah, they're already making money on these pills on something that, well, I would say, um, well, they claim this. They claim, well, the research wasn't all wrong. The amyloid idea is not proven to be the full case, but is also not completely false. Amyloid plaques are real and consistently found in Alzheimer's brains. The debate is whether they are the cause or just a piece of the process. Well, I guess you'll never know until you spend the next 15 years doing actual research to make up for the 15 years of bad research, right? So, the drugs that they have do remove some amyloid plaques from the brain. That part works biologically. Even though they remove plaques, patients show only modest slowing of decline. They do not cure Alzheimer's. They do not stop full progression. So both things are true at the same time. The drugs do what they are designed to do to clear the amyloid, but they don't do anything else, right? Because nobody ever really knew what the amyloid was all about in the first place. See how circular this whole thing gets? So they built drugs that remove what they see as amyloids, but the disease isn't just what you see. And that's what the results didn't match the promise. So, yeah, they spent tens of billions. The future market is supposedly tens of billions. They have a 98% failure rate, decades of dead ends. Many companies lost money before the recent drugs. It cost about $5 to $6 billion over a decade to bring a single Alzheimer's drug to market, and nearly all of them failed. That's why the system keeps doubling down on the same path. It's too expensive to start over. Now, that's some psychologic if I've ever read it. Let me read it again. It costs $5 to $6 billion and over a decade to bring a single Alzheimer's drug to market, and nearly all of them fail. That's why the system keeps doubling down on the same path. It's too expensive to start over. This isn't just science. It's a $5 billion bet every time. And when you're already spent that kind of money, you don't walk away from the theory. You try to make it work. So yeah, they're not making the big money right now, but they got their chops looking for the big money. And remember, this is how doctors will explain it, okay? Let me clear out, get my doctor voice. I'm entering the room in my white coat. Picture me as your doctor. They'll say, well, this may slow decline slightly. It does not reverse or cure the disease. There's risk, but we need to monitor. So they say, well, it may slow decline slightly, right? And we're not sure it can risk or cure it, but there are risks that we have to monitor, okay? And here's where it really gets insane, right? So the people So instead of saying, well, this fails 98% of the time, the people hear things like, well, historically, many treatments have not worked, but this is one of the first to show some effect. I have heard that time and time about every single one of these test things. People are hanging on to their last breath from cancer. Well, it'll give you some more time to spend with your family as you're choking and hanging on with your last breath. They just want to. This is why they never finish their own research into psychopaths because they're all a bunch of people who also are masochistic, right? And they're also sadomasochistic. They love to dish out and receive pain themselves. So what do you think? They're going to come up with the most painly stuff for us, right? That way, your family's going to end up broke, diffused mentally. And remember, this is a war against our minds, right? It's not just a war against our bodies. Your whole family goes down when dad's over in the corner gasping for air. Everybody's trying to convince him that, come on, dad, just a couple more weeks, couple more pills. They said it slows things down. Please try it. Please try it. And then dad dies. You lose the house. Everybody's thrown out in the streets. See how this all works on a mental basis after they get the real person, the rest of them they just do mental dynamics with. So on paper, drugs work biologically. They remove the amyloid, but the benefit became modest. The cost is high. Risk, but the risk is not. The risk wasn't isn't low. Okay, I think I have that down here. Uh, yes, the treatments are expensive. Doctors are known for a history of failures. So one doctors know the track record, decades of failed drugs. What they offer now isn't a cure. It's a costly attempt to slow something we still don't fully understand. So yeah, and here's what happens when they actually give you these pills. Okay, um, this amyloid relating imaging abnormalities. So they find these they have to send you in for constant scans and stuff when you're taking these pills, right? They're just kind of brushing them off as, well, we're just doing due diligence on a few of these things, right? So they're sending you in for all these tests, right? But what they're really looking for is this brain swelling. My, excuse me. They're looking for brain swelling. They find that in 12 to 13% of patients taking these pills. They're looking for brain bleeding, and they find that in about 17% of these patients taking these pills. So I think what ends up happening is they're doing all these tests because the doctor, I think they probably just want to make sure you don't drop dead on their watch, right? And they get serious symptoms from these drugs. They get confusion, headaches, and dizziness. And the deaths, the reports and trials and post-trial, they're often linked to blood thinners and high-risk patients. So yeah, what happens is, and these other drugs, they just make your brain swell faster. So yeah, these drugs will make your brain bleed, they'll make it swell, and you'll get complications. But hey, if you want to try it, it may expand you just a little bit, right? Because here's what they have to do because of all these risks. You have to go in for regular MIR scans. And those things are pretty dangerous, right? Before and after treatments. You have to slow or stop using drugs if this area appears. You have to careful screening before starting. Yeah. Um, so, of this one drug, 1 in 4 people get brain swelling. 1 in 3 get some bleeding. So they say some of these cases are just mild or temporary. So that's good news, right? But a small percentage are serious. A very small number can be fatal. The drugs are not low risk. These drugs don't just target the brain, they can affect it. Up to 1 in 4 patients develop swelling and bleeding and is common enough that doctors have to scan the brain regularly just to keep it safe. Um, so, yeah, they'll give you these drugs, but the drugs are probably going to do you in too, right? So let me see. That's why the people taking these drugs are usually still aware enough to experience both the disease and the treatment. Yeah, that's pretty bad, right? So the patients taking these drugs are usually still aware to experience both the disease and the treatment. So that's why they frame it like things like small, slowly declining, or cost monitoring and risk. Doctors and families are weighing that while the patient can still participate in the choice. So these treatments are given while people still know what's happening. So the question isn't abstract. It's whether a small delay is worth the cost and the risk while you're still aware enough to feel both. So both of these drugs, the benefit, small, slow decline, not a cure. Swelling, regular infusions, appointments, logistics, early stage diseases. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know. I think it's all because everybody wants to have a little more time. Months of slower decline, a desire to act rather than wait. So, yeah, people will throw it all out the window. We want to keep you alive, Grandma. We want to keep you alive. Listen to the doctor. Take those pills. Please, Grandma. Please, please, please. Yeah, that's how it all works. The doctors gang up on you, your friends and family gang up on you. Before you know it, you're taking those pills, right? So, anyway, so what really happens though is Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services cover these drugs with conditions. Patients typically owe 20% co-insurance when they have supplemental insurance. So yeah, there is a real high deal about taking these pills and stuff. I mean, really, they really want to drive you to the point that when you're dead, they got your house, they got everything, right? They got your family in grief, they got your kids broken, they got everybody running around in circles, and then come in the people that are going to bury that poor person, right? They want $10,000 to bury Grandpa. Wait a minute, but Grandpa was a nice man. Yeah, so that's what happens when you go to doctors and them, right? They'll tell you everything you think you want to hear. If you want to live a little bit longer, they'll say, "Yeah, well we have been starting to see some pretty good results." Yeah, well, I can understand because I had it happen to a relative of mine. Well, they went the same course as you, and I would really, I would really think that maybe talk it over with your family and see what they have to say. It's a big decision that you should all be making. And I've been faced with that myself, but yeah, I came to that decision and yeah, I gave my relatives and my friends the pills too because I'm a lying doctor. No, that is why doctors wear two snakes on their coats, right? Never forget that part. They're wearing those two snakes on those logos for a very specific reason, right? They say, well, yeah, some people slow down. Yeah, some people, but if 1 in 4 can develop brain swelling and bleeding, I would say, and you're going to have to be going in for a bunch of MRIs and stuff, I would have to say this whole Alzheimer medicine and drug thing has been pretty much a bust, right? I guess the next step would be to figure out, well, how many people let me see. I have some new numbers. Let me read you those first. Brain swelling up to 12 to 24%. Brain bleeding 17 to 31%. Yeah, those regular MRIs are going to also do you in, right? You also have to have regular IV infusions, frequent brain scans, ongoing specialist visits, time and travel burdens. And the drug alone will cost $25,000 to $30,000 a year. The total care might cost you $50,000 to $90,000 a year. Patients may still pay thousands out of pocket. So it's the first disease modifying therapy, is how they're framing it. First disease modifying therapy. The reality, the first drugs to show some measurable effect. Yeah, they can say that, right? They did show some measurable effect. Hey, a percentage of the people are still living, aren't they? But long term impact is still uncertain and debated. The market focuses on relative improvement, percentages, hope and action, approval status. So, yeah, it's all about These drugs are not fake breakthroughs. They're limited tools presented in ways that can sound much bigger than their real world impact. Well, I would go further than that. I would say they are fake breakthroughs from start to finish, right? So, yeah. So, laboratory creation. First, we had the first thing with sulfur and all that stuff starting in 1882. They started studying it 1860. By the mid 1800s, scientists already knew that sulfur caused severe chemical burns. And already in the late 1800s, they were studying it. I've covered all of this in the past, and I have it all written for you down below. 1916 to 1917, the German medical chemists developed it as a weapon. Then it shifted from a lab chemical to a military agent when it went to mustard gas, right? What made it different was it did not kill immediately. It caused severe skin blistering, eye damage and blindness, lung injury, persisted in soil and clothing, and prolonged exposure. But by 1917 to 1918, it was used by both sides of the war to go after people. This is about a kill box. So here are the dates. 1822, it was first synthesized. 1860, the effects were documented about sulfur. Late 1800s, it was studied in labs. Toxicity was understood. 1916 to 1917, it was weaponized by Germany. July 1917, first battlefield use in World War I. 1917 to 18, widespread